Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to ACES Tech Bites. This is our last Tech Bites of the term. Thank you for attending. Tonight, Matt Meyernick from the NCAR Library and Information Services Department will be talking about library contributions to institutional research data curation challenges. Matt Meyernick is a research data services specialist at the Library for NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He received his master's in Library and Information Science in 2007 and his PhD in Information Studies in 2011 from the UCLA Department of Information Studies. His work within the NCAR Library is focused on developing research data services, including developing policy and implementation plans for data citations across NCAR. His research interests also include metadata practices and standards, cyber infrastructure development, and social aspects of research data. Thank you again to Matt, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Ian, and happy to be here. And I think if you have any questions as I'm going through, please feel free to chip in. I'm going to sort of explain what a lot of these acronyms and terms and institutional names mean as I go along, especially at the beginning. So my talk is going to focus a lot on what I'm doing at NCAR. It's also going to try to step back and talk about kind of data practices within libraries more generally. And I know you had Andrew Johnson from EU visit not too long ago who talked about a similar topic. And so I'll try to also draw some contrast between what we're doing at NCAR and kind of the research center world versus maybe what you might have to deal with. Okay, so just to start off with, NCAR. NCAR is the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and UCAR is the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. And don't be too concerned about the differences between them. They're really one entity that's split bureaucratically. NCAR is the science organization, and UCAR is really the management organization that also has units that provide educational services and some data infrastructure services and support for science services. So this is the NCAR Mesa Lab, which if you've been in Boulder, you may have seen. NCAR has a couple of other locations around Boulder. So NCAR is a research, it's a federally funded research and development center. So a lot of the funding is from the National Science Foundation, but there are some independent projects that are funded by industry and other government organizations. But it's a research center with about 500 scientists, broadly focusing on many kinds of geosciences. And so you probably can't read the little words here, but what you're seeing really is everything shown in this diagram are somebody at NCAR is probably studying. Obviously the atmosphere and clouds and things like that. There's also a solar observatory. There's people who study oceans and sea and ice, glaciers, also how these all impact the atmosphere. Lots of different things going on. NCAR is about 500 scientists, like I said, and UCAR is about 1,000 more people, support staff. And as a research agency, there's also a lot of data, and there's collected, lots of data being hosted. I'll talk some more about that, and also used. And these are just some examples of different types. Climate models and sort of simulations to actual field experiments where they go out for a week or two. Situations. And here's another thing you probably can't read very well, but NCAR also has a bunch of data archives. And this is just kind of a list, and you can look at the slides later. I think this is something that does set a research center apart from, say, universities. There's lots of support for data within some of the computations. Have scientists who manage data archives, part of their job. So there are a number of them, and this is just a partial list, and there's actually probably 10 or 15 on this list. Library, in the Integrated Information Services group, we're just starting to work with some of these other parts of the organization in developing data-specific services. Integrated information services is kind of this big, long term that groups a bunch of different people within NCAR. So the NCAR library is part of this group, and it's a library like most others. Blogging, there's an archive, all of the reference services and things like that. Group of folks that do development of digital education resources. So digital library development for various kinds of earth science resources, and these are just some examples of that. And then, like I said, we're just starting research data initiatives, and I'm kind of leading. The first one is data citation. I'm going to talk more about that. But I'll come back at the end where we see this going and how we see this initial initiative leading to more data-related developing. So the data citation initiative really came about when a number of the managers of the data archives that I showed on the previous page came to the library and asked for help in developing data citation capabilities. And come back to this at the end, but that's really something that I think a library can contribute to an environment like NCAR is coordination among lots of groups who maybe individually don't have the capacity or the knowledge to deal with something like citations. And I'll go through. That's kind of something that we can really, I think, help. So citations, the issue around data citations is really one of it's kind of coming from a number of different directions. So there's lots of federal interests, and I have another slide on this, but the National Science Foundation both had workshops related to data citation in the past. And in the geosciences, the professional societies are also very important. And so we're also seeing some interest from, for example, the American Geophysical Union or the American Meteorological Society. And this is just a statement from 2009 from AGU where they talk about endorsing the concept of publication of data credited and cited. So NCAR's interest really comes out of some of these other sets of interests. And this is just another example of that. Very recently, the National Science Foundation issued a Dear Colleague letter, the Geoscience Directorate, which is essentially an announcement that this is something that you should pay attention to. Specific to data citation. And again, it's probably kind of hard to read, but what they talk about is there are many challenges still that remain to be resolved, but they want to have an evolutionary transformation to establish data citation within the geosciences as the rule rather than the exception. Lots of interest, and we're kind of trying to be a leader in that area. Okay, so just getting into it, what do we actually mean by data citation? And it's literally a citation to a data set. Seems kind of obvious, but these are just a citation to a journal article, a citation to a data set. And you see kind of a similar structure, the same kinds of things, an author, a title, some dates, maybe a distributor, or in the case of a journal, it's the journal title, then the DOI, which I'll come back to more later. And on the surface, it kind of seems, like why do we need multiple initiatives to be promoting data citations? But in fact, it's not. It's actually very uncommon right now for scientists to cite data. I'll come back to that as well. But the reasons why there are a lot of interest in citations, again, comes from multiple directions. For a data center like NCAR, really the interest is in making data more findable and accessible. So through the citation mechanism, it's kind of a direct. And then it's measuring data use. So once you have citations, you can potentially count those, and that's. And also for a data center, it helps to improve service. The scientists or researchers who are collecting data, it's, again, to get an understanding of how your data are being used. And potentially, again, if you have citations that you can count, you can get credit that goes along with the credits from your citations to your publications. And for users, it's really more an issue of transparency. If you're citing your data, you're making your sources known. If you're not citing your data, potentially it can be hard to reproduce your study and allow other people to follow what you're doing. So there's kind of multiple motivations from different directions. There are some recommendations out there for citations. These are just a couple examples. The ESIP organization, Earth Science Information Partners in the US, developed some that are specific to earth science data. The Digital Curation Center in the UK has also developed kind of some a little more general purpose guidelines. I think what's interesting about these is they're fairly detailed, and they're both really more aimed at repositories than necessarily a scientist. And that's kind of a big issue because what I'm showing here, and I mentioned earlier, is that currently it's not very common for people to cite data. Acknowledging their data use, they'll mention it in the method section of an article. We'll say, or they'll add an acknowledgement in the acknowledgement section. Useful, but it's also limiting in how it allows people to then follow what you've done. So what you're seeing in this diagram is from a couple of folks at the data center, which is also in Boulder. They did a study, kind of a quick study, where they did a Google Scholar search on this term MODIS snow-covered data, and MODIS is a NASA satellite. What you can see is that the use of the data set, according to the occurrence of this term, is pretty consistently growing over the past 10 years. But the citations are that tiny sliver there on the left. It's very minuscule. So what this is showing is that off the use of data, the citations are really. Another issue to point out here is that MODIS snow-covered data is actually extremely vague. They're talking to one of the authors of this paper, they said about 12 different data products that could fall under this category. So just saying you use MODIS snow-covered data is actually very vague. Provide the kind of transparency that. This is another example. This is kind of interesting as well. This is some folks from a number of places put together a data set of various indicators of Arctic warming and cooling trends over the past 2,000 years. So it's tree rings and ice cores and things like that. And they've had a paper published in Science in 2009, I think. And then they archived their data with NOAA. So this is actually the page where you could access. Click on the data itself, you get this page. It might be kind of hard to read. What is really interesting is right under the title is a line that says, "Note, please cite original reference when using this data," 5 exclamation points. So what they're saying is they really want you to cite the paper. They don't want you to cite the data set. And it may be that they're not even really aware of the idea of citing it. But this is, again, an indication that scientists have very specific interests in they get credit for citations to publications, not necessarily. So, there's kind of lots of components to this. So now getting more into what we're doing here at NCAR is a combination of technical and more policy work. And you sort of need these together. I'll sort of hopefully show that as we go. From a technical side, it's, like I said, DOIs for data. I'm guessing many of you know what DOIs are. It's library. But just to go through it, so DOIs provide a persistent location mechanism for internet-based resources. The goal is to get past the URLs dying over time. And various studies that show that between, I think it's 20 and 50% of URLs that are included in citations are dead in about 5 years when they were initially published. So that's a big issue, and that's what the DOI was intended. DOIs were initially developed for the journal system. That's still the main use. There are a lot of increasing uses for data. So and this is actually one of the 2 NCAR DOIs that we've minted so far. So that's another thing I should say is we're still in the beginning process of this, even though it's been an ongoing. So again, DOIs, this is the way they work. You add the standards x.doi.org's server name to any DOI, and it will resolve to the current location of that resource. In this case, this is the data set that's by NCAR called NARCAP, North American Regional Climate Change Assessment Program. So DOIs are in some ways fairly simple, but it's also a lot of then policy work that's involved to decide how you want to assign DOIs to data sets. So a big issue is figuring out what's the best sort of way to assign a DOI. Data sets are different from journal articles in that they're not kind of unitary objects. I'll come back to this in a second. Very fuzzy boundaries around them. That's sort of the other thing we've been doing is developing recommendations, working very closely with the article, figure out what are the best ways to ensure that those are going to be maintained over time. Because permanence, again, is just as much an issue with DOIs as it is with any other use. Data archive needs to make sure that the DOI. And then providing recommended citations to data users is also an issue. And that's really where we're borrowing from the recommendations like the ESIP and the DCC. So this is just kind of an example of that. And then outreach, again, is, I mentioned before, scientists and data users. Proactively informing there and that they have DOIs. So this is what I mentioned before. This is kind of why it's taken us 12 months to get to the point where we're assigning just a few DOIs as test cases. And I'm not going to go through these in a lot of detail, but just to kind of touch on them, because I think they're all important in this kind of topic. So as I mentioned earlier, there are probably 14 or 15 different data archiving teams within NCAR. Some of them are more formally organized than others. That means there's lots of different kinds of data, even within a geoscience organization. You know, the solar data is different. That teams have, you know, play their data in different ways, so that will provide a citation. So diversity is a big one. Data set boundary issues are more around granularity and version control. So data sets, particularly I think in the geosciences, can be very hierarchical. One quote-unquote data set might have thousands of files or millions of files. And so, you know, version control is more about sort of horizontal relationships. If something changes, and that publications, once published, really don't change. If something changes, data sets, they're constantly changing. Some data sets are constantly changing, not all, but a big one in NCAR and I think other geoscience organizations is that data sets will be continually updated as more measurements come in. They're just observatories that are out there, or satellites that are sort of continuously going. The data set itself is constantly growing, changing. So if you cite a data set today that's got another year's worth of values in a year from now, is it the same data set? So that's kind of it's actually kind of a hotly debated topic among this very small and insular group of people who are working on data citations, but there are different approaches to how you will address that, and so that's something. And then the last issue is maintenance issue, and for publishers who are putting these citations in their articles, this is really the biggest issue for them because they want to know that if you publish an article and it has a citation to a data set, that citation is still going to be good 5 years or 10 years or 20 years from now, because their expectation when they publish an article is the article is going to be there 10 or 20 years from now. They want to be able to say the same thing about anything that's being cited, including data sets. So this is something we've been working a lot on and trying to develop some kind of initial policy statement on what does it mean to assign a DOI. Is it a statement of kind of responsibility or expectation another reason why we've kind of gone slow and actually starting to assign them. Where we are, I mentioned we've assigned a couple DOIs, but we've also, before that, we had to establish a membership for the DOI. Probably more important is we developed a white paper working with the data archiving community to sort of put all these recommendations together and to put all the issues out on the table so that everyone's sort of aware of them. Community building has been a big issue. It's probably been a good percentage of what I've been doing over the past year is just going to all the different groups, talking to them about what are the issues from your perspective on this topic. And then organizing pilot projects. And I haven't really talked about it, but we're also looking at citations to software and potentially some other. And within the library, we have an institutional repository, and so a whole set of. It's also a service that we've been able to use internally. Now I'm going to step back a little bit and talk some about how this fits into what I see as kind of a longer-term trajectory for the library within an organization like NCAR. And like I said at the beginning, I think that there's two main I think ways that the library can really contribute to this. First one is coordination among like lots of different groups who all have expertise in particular ways or particular types of systems. May not have the expertise or necessarily the capacity to coordinate among all of the groups who might be stakeholders in a topic like citations. This is something that potentially benefit and be useful for a lot of groups. It's not just one group. Citations and DOIs are the first topic that we've really been making progress on. But there are a couple of others that have kind of come out. And I mentioned earlier, long-term data policies. That's I think an issue that we'll be working on. NCAR has a data policy and kind of an access policy, which was resources, including publications and data. Nothing in that policy specifically about the long-term. Data becomes more important as the long-term, the expectation is the data will be available for the long-term. I think having that policy explicitly set out is going to be important. So we're just starting that. Another related topic is peer review of data. It's kind of a connected one to most resources that are cited are peer-reviewed publications. Citing data sets and you're being asked to for how do we indicate that those resources are of high quality? So how do we know that people aren't just citing things because they have something on their server and they want to cite evaluation of data archives and what does it mean to have a quality data set that's been sort of. And then the last one I think on this coordination issue is if we're going to have a way to, if we're going to be promoting citations and asking people to cite data, then we need to have ways to count those citations as they start. There's some interest from the big indexing companies like Thomson Reuters who include data sets and DOIs from data sets. And everything I've heard, it's still very much at the beginning. Close to rolling out. Some other ways of doing that is still something. And then the last slide I think is also where we're headed in the future, to fill where there are some gaps in the NCAR. We have many data archives, like I mentioned, but all of them are pretty specific to individual. But there are a lot of scientists. It's a big organization that I kind of follow between some of these archives. And I think we really don't even know how big these gaps are yet. So definitely true as I've been going around talking to a lot of different folks that, yes, I'm very interested in having my data cited and having sort of getting. What do I do? My data are on my website, they're on my server. Sort of document them, we're willing to share them, but we don't really know what. This is where the library can kind of chip in, and with an NCAR we can potentially work with some knowing what potentially repositories or NCAR. So that's, I think, where we're going in the future, and we've, again, just kind of started. Really, this came out of the question, like I said, as the library, we're going to be offering DOIs and service, we need to be able to offer that institutional service to all of our institutions. So if there are some groups who are not part of data archiving teams, we need to figure out how we can provide that service. So I think this is to be a very interesting and exciting potential direction for us to go in the future. That's my last slide, and I'll just stop here. And these are a couple of links. I mentioned the white paper. It's at this first link, and it will be updated, but it's there. Then I think Ian was at the workshop, Bridging Data Lifecycles, last month. There's lots of information there.
Quite a few good slideshows.
Yeah, lots of good slideshows, and I'm working on a report that will eventually come out, kind of going over some of the main points from that.
I think there's a couple questions showing up on the chat.
Okay. Okay, first question: are there costs or other difficulties related to DOI registration? Yes, there are costs. And it varies depending on what registration service you use. The two main ones are the data site organization and Crossref. Crossref is the main DOI registration service for journal articles. So the vast majority of DOIs that you'll see associated with a journal article are registered through. They do offer registration for data sets, but it's, in my opinion, still kind of cursory. It's not necessarily there. Data site is, as the name suggests, specifically developing registration services for. So there are various ways that you can work with data site, and that's what we're doing. Is we've got a member of data site. It's kind of another hierarchical organization, but we're working with a group out of the California Digital Library, which is called EZID, and providing the DOI registration service. And the cost depends on the kind of the size of your institution. But it's actually not very costly, I should say. Okay, second question. This sounds like an enormous project. How many scientists are you potentially working with at NCAR? Good question. So we have a data citation working group who's been the main set of people who are participating in this. Those are mostly managers of data archives, some technical folk within specific archiving teams, a few other kind of people who might have expertise, so some software engineers who have experience in developing standards. That working group is probably about between people, and it's kind of grown over time. I think it started with maybe 6 or 7. Again, as I said, as I've been going around talking to different groups, I've been kind of getting representatives from different labs to come and participate. That's probably, I'd say, about the size of what we've been doing so far. And we are, in a lot of ways, letting the individual labs organize within their data. For example, I'm not going out and doing all the organization within each of those archives that I should. Have maybe 1 or 2 representatives from most of them, and then they've kind of been making the decisions within their specific potentially be including archivable data sets from former employees? A good question, and I think that's probably, initially the answer is we're only working with data sets that we're hosting. So if it's in one of our systems that the archiving teams have, that's kind of where we'll start. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned before, the long term. We're not going to be assigning DOIs to access to and sort of openness. And, you know, there's always some hedging on this, and that, you know, we never know when shut down next year and NCAR gets shut down, and, you know, what's gonna happen, who knows. But as of now, as long as NCAR exists, we expect that, you know, these data sets will exist. That's kind of where we're starting, and that's why I said one of the future directions will be trying to plug those gaps of folks who have data sets on their servers or their value, but for whatever reason just haven't gotten kind of the long-term attention yet. How long, okay, another question. How long is this project expected to take to get all previous datasets registered and archived? That's a good question. We're starting kind of slow, but I think it'll accelerate over the next maybe 6 months. A couple of the groups will be probably backfilling all of their collections. We're probably not going to be assigning DOIs to all previous data sets. I think, again, within individual teams, they'll decide how extensive they want to be in their collections. The climate model data, I think, is an interesting case here. Climate model data is simulation data. So they've run a model saying this is what has happened in the past, or this is what I think will happen in the future based on. So traditionally there's kind of been this thought that model simulation data are actually less useful and valuable over time because models from 5 years ago aren't as good as models from today. And so now that you have a new model, you really want to use the new data. You don't want to use the old model data. It's different than observational data where you can't go back and recollect data. You can go back and rerun a model that was run yesterday. I don't know, 5 years ago maybe is a bigger question, but I think that's kind of changing over time. So initially, we're just going to be assigning DOIs to the most recent version of one of NCAR's big clients. I'm not sure if we're going to be going back to previous client models. So, again, because I'm not sure how widely they're used.
What is the, do you have a rule of thumb when you're figuring out what kind of keep everything in perpetuity, or
yeah, that's a good question. And the model, again, going back to the model case, that's actually a case where they do have a policy that says 5 years they'll keep everything from the model, all the data. After 5 years, they may start to. It doesn't specify what sort of parts they might keep and what they won't. I think it's more going to be based on value over time. Within the observational and other kinds of data archive, the answer really is, for the most part, they keep everything, but occasionally things are off of, for example, the web server. So they may be put on kind of deep storage where they're still accessible, but you kind of have to go through a bit more process to get to them. And that's with the major archiving teams. With the smaller data sets, I think that's kind of still an open question.
when you're talking about models, is that
They're kind of a mix. The models, most of the models that I'm talking about are very, very big, complex models. They are based on kind of the best understanding of the environment at the time. So they'll have all of the kind of current physics around atmospheric circulation are around kind of how all those things are interconnected. And they use observational data as feed in to the model. So we'll feed observations in to see what will happen then if we have all the conditions that we know for today. What will our model tell us will happen over the next? Also, we'll use observational data to validate the model. So they may simulate the past 2,000 years and look at the observational data that they do have to say, yes, this tracks what our model says, or no.
Online before you can cite it.
Varies, and I think it really depends on how much attention was paid to this issue when the data was collected.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure
Right. So if people collect data and again have it on their probably there's going to be a lot of work involved to then do all the documentation after the fact. Some of the groups they work with the scientists from the beginning. And again, I think this is research center like NCAR versus support for data management. So they'll start actually with the groups before the project even starts and talk to them about what are your needs for data management, what are your expectations for your data product, available, et cetera, and then they work with them once the project has started to then actually make sure that it works as the project is ongoing. And then there are folks who then do the sort of process of cleaning and aggregating data sets. Really the question is it's less about kind of what types of data as sort of thought was put into the process at the beginning. Other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to those of you online.